Welcome to We Talk. I'm Marjorie Morgan and I'm here with a new guest this week, and I'd like my guests to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Marge. Good afternoon, good morning, hello, good evening, perhaps. My name's Joe Ramsden. I am, among many things, a son of Diane and John. I am a community development worker here in Toxteth L8. I'm also a theatre producer. I like to write. I'm a keen reader, and I am here today to talk with Marge about life, the universe, and everything. And maybe we'll look at a few topics that are close to both our hearts, because we both connected over talking about mental health and well-being. So I imagine that will kind of flavor the discussion that we have. But yeah, there's a I guess there's a lot to say about me and where I'm coming from and stuff, but that's some of the stuff that I do and some of the stuff that I am too. So yeah, I hope you'll get to know both of us a little bit better over the next hour or so.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. Well, one of the many things you got lots of feathers to your bow, you just spoke about there, was about your theatre work. So if we kind of start off with that, theatre producer and writer, and then we'll go into the other areas, like, as you say, health and well-being. I really want to talk to you about that. But because I think I first met you in the EV.
Yeah, I remember it very well. Yeah. It was a great first encounter. So I think I'd be curious to know what your impressions of the experience was. But for me, it was the first time that I became aware of Marge Morgan, the writer, was in the Everyman studio for one of the Scratch studios, and we were. I think the first time we met, I don't think that it was we were watching something that you yourself had written, but we were watching other writers.
Yeah, I was there supporting.
Yeah, and we had a very nice sort of conversation in the kind of in the sort of the atrium, the kind of in the sort of the liminal space, the kind of in between outside, was sort of as we were both leaving the theatre. I think someone kindly introduced us, but I recall very, very distinctly us both sort of recognizing each other and not quite being able to place where we knew each other from. But being in these same spaces together, we'd become familiar to one another. And it was just a very sort of joyous first interaction. We had a lot in common immediately, both having lived and grown in Wiltshire, in the southwest, having both come to Liverpool and found sort of new leases of life through the theatre and through writing. And I think we were both on that particular day feeling very sort of softly spoken and being very sort of observant of what we were doing and what we were watching and the world around us. And so we were on a very similar kind of energetic level that day. And so I came away with like a really nice feeling about that when you kind of, and we had some interactions, subsequently to that. I remember one time you reached out to me via telephone, and we had a conversation about I think it was Light Night or something, or perhaps or something, or I couldn't tell you what it was, but you were seeking some sort of advice on something, and I remember using the phrase, "Well, in my professional opinion," and which you took very good humoredly. So,
well, I did reach out for your professional opinion. It was a Scratch evening that was going to take place at Hope Street Theatre. I think I eventually worked with Nancy, but you're all in the same kind of group. And I was like, oh, I need to know these people.
And it was for me it was a very strange experience, in the most wonderful way of sort of being asked for something which I hadn't quite acknowledged that I had any expertise there. But as my mother says, like, we're all experts in our own experience. and I think
love that.
I didn't really have that as a frame of reference at the time. So being asked for, you know, for something, for, you know, an opinion or on something that that I knew about still felt quite unusual at the time, and that was only a few years ago. And then of course Nancy's now, you know, a trainee producer at the Everyman. She's doing great stuff with Falling Doors too, her theatre company, and yeah, and you and I have kind of sort of been around each other's orbits, sort of in a very sort of confluent sort of way, sort of just sort of around. So
I feel it right to mention Rio at this point as well.
Yes,
Rio's been a sort of a linchpin to our connection.
Indeed.
Even though she's abandoned us and moved up to Leeds.
She's spreading her wings, isn't she, in the white rose of the north over in Yorkshire. But yes, lovely. Yeah, Rio Matchett. Yeah, what a gal. So how did you first meet Rio? What was your introduction to Rio?
Rio was on the desk, and when I went into the Ev, and sometimes people on the desk are not very friendly, which I've had discussions about before. But Rio was an exception to that. So she was the most helpful person you could ever meet. And so, as is my wont when people extend kindness, I asked her name, and from that moment onward, we've always spoken, you know. And it's just like she kind of got me, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do.
And she facilitated my ease in the environment. So, you know, with people like that in your life, you know, whether you pass them occasionally or you know them in depth, it always makes a difference, in the theatre world especially. But one of the things you were talking about, I know we've got lots of lovely people in common. I just want to go back to something that you spoke about that we've got in common, are being brought up in Wiltshire.
Yes.
So can you tell me a bit about your experience growing up in the West Country before you moved up north?
Yeah, this will allow me to reflect. I was born in Burnley, so before moving down south, I grew up for a few years around Rossendale, which is a lovely part of Lancashire. And I think very fondly of that time. It was a very small little hamlet, you know, sort of a workers' village with but a post office and a pub and that rows of houses, very close to the reservoirs where we take lots of lovely walks. And then my dad got a job at Wiltshire County Council, and so we moved down south to relocate as a family and start a new life in the West Country. And around about that same time, my brother was born, Josh, and so he and I grew up together, and yet equal, and yet later on in separately around Wiltshire and Somerset. And my experience of the West Country, with hindsight, was one which kind of provides a foil to my experiences of living in Liverpool, where the quality of life, or my own experience of life in these two very different situations, really draw out the sort of the polarities between the two places. You know, Wiltshire's a very it is a rural county. The towns where I lived and went to school, Westbury and Warminster, were so unlike Liverpool in so many ways, from something as abstract to like the mindset of folks living there, and the importance of certain elements of life. You know, I'm thinking of, like, you know, just the way in which people interacted with each other. We'll joke all the time, won't we, about how friendly the North is, but you only really get an appreciation of that when when you're outside of that situation. And so moving from Wiltshire to Liverpool when I was about 16, I really saw a huge difference in the way in which folks, communicate with each other. That sort of classic scenario of being at the bus stop, waiting for the 82 or whatever, and someone striking up a conversation with you, and it feeling like the most natural thing in the world in the city, feels like a world away from the experiences down south.
Well, in Liverpool, you get to know somebody's life story before the bus has arrived.
Yeah.
Not just
absolutely.
them, their whole family, their grands, their cousins.
Absolutely. You'll end up saying, well, I hope little Rosie has a fantastic christening. I give my best to the kids, look forward to seeing you soon. And that strangely, almost paradoxically, the small village ideal that perhaps ought to exist in these smaller rural towns is really exemplified in a city like Liverpool, where so much of our communication with one another is openly friendly and inviting and warm too, in a way in which I came to really appreciate and feel comfortable with once I moved here.
Do you ever go back to Wiltshire, and what are the polarities that you talk about apart from communication that you've experienced?
Do you know, I've dreamt about it, like literally dreamt about it a lot, and it's one of those reoccurring dreams. I dream of going back to Westbury, which was the town that I lived in, many times, and there are particular places that I want to go, and I haven't been back to the town since, I would guess, like 2008, maybe 2009. I couldn't be quite sure the exact date which I left, but curiously enough, trying to find a frame of reference for it without going back there, I went online, I went onto YouTube, and I found footage of 2008 of Warminster, which was the town where I went to school, exactly as I remembered it. And so in my mind, it's kind of frozen almost in a mental time capsule of being a particular way. And I would love to burst that bubble and to sort of to return and to see for myself what it looks like, what it feels like to be in a place that was once home and once a place for me to grow and to develop, and to sort of further examine those polarities that were mentioned. I guess there's so much that I could go into there, but immediately the first things that came to mind upon moving to Liverpool was just the access to a new way of living, a new kind of life, where if you imagine, going to the Theatre Royal in Bath to go and watch a show was an extremely auspicious event, something to really to look forward to in, with great anticipation. And
it's a dressing up day.
It's a dressing up day indeed, and something that that really stayed with me when I moved to the city was that experience of going with my dad to watch a Sherlock Holmes adaptation. We went to go and watch The Hound of the Baskervilles, or some telling of that story there, and having seats in the stall and being able to see the breath of the actors on stage and getting an ice cream at the interval. All of those, really lovely childhood memories that suddenly became immediately accessible. And so having access to spaces like the Everyman and Playhouse theatres, where through schemes like the Young Everyman and Playhouse, I was able to see a show for the small price of £5, which was cheaper than going to the cinema. It just immediately made me able to access spaces that had until that point been reserved for special occasions and not for something that felt like it could be a part of my life and therefore my identity, I think, as well. I never considered myself going into the theatre. I never considered a career there until it became an option. And I can't overstate just how important, you know, moving to Liverpool and having the invitation of the Everyman and Playhouse and their program of making theatre accessible to younger people facilitated that. It was that difference between the physical journey between home and a theatre like what the one in Bath or Bristol or wherever, to being able to walk from my house in Toxteth, you know, up Princess Boulevard and onto Hope Street in a matter of minutes, and being able to see, you know, some of the best theatre the country and even the world has to offer. It's a real game changer, and I loved it.
That's amazing, really, because when you're talking about your home, once your home, your physical home moved, your emotional and spiritual home changed as well. And that also wrought a change in your identity. So how is your identity from when you were a child, how is that different now that you're a young adult?
Gosh, this is something that I'm very mindful of at the moment, and I think there's something that creeps up on you, you know, that suddenly, you know, you look in the mirror one day, so to speak, and you realize that you're not the boy you were, or you realize you're not even the same man you were a year ago. And I think the intensity of the past year, of the past, you know, 14 months, 15 months, however long we've been living under these unusual circumstances, the magnification of who I am is really, or the examination of who I am has really come to the forefront of my mind. So when you ask me, you know, what's the difference between the man that I am now and the boy that I was, it's everything and nothing. You know, it's like, you know, when I was 6-7 years old, I was kind of, you know, just starting school. I wasn't really much of a schoolgoer. When I started my, it's a classic story, or rather event that would reoccur on the way to school in the morning. My mum very quickly recognized that I was not thriving in the education system, and she would drive me, you know, towards the school gates, and she'd turn to me and she'd say, "Joe, do you want to go to school today?" And or you know, "Do you want to go to the beach?" And I, you know, some days I go, "No, I think school today. You know, I want to go and see my friend Harry, or I want to, you know, I want to do this particular, you know, thing in whatever it was, you know, this particular thing in class that kept my attention." And yet there was the option to go, "Nah, today's a beach day. Let's go to the beach." And we go to Weymouth, or we'd go to Poole, or we'd go someplace else. And, you know, I'd go and meet other children, you know, who were, you know, usually younger than me because of, you know, most of my peers being in school, but I'd have the option to kind of to connect with people outside of the sort of formal school setting. And thankfully, you know, my mum allowed that to be a part of my upbringing. And so, you know, when I say everything and nothing is the same, it's that, you know, those first sort of 6-7 years of my life where I was like sort of dipping my toe into school and then coming out and then sort of like, you know, changing schools. And, you know, I had several different, I had about 4 different primary schools. And during that time, I very much can identify like the moments where, you know, habits and behaviors formed that informed, you know, the man that I became and the man I am right now. And then yet throughout that, you know, that sort of that almost no difference in sort of, you know, the first 7 years of my life and, you know, the past 7 days of my life, you know, everything has changed, you know, Marge, everything has changed in that time. You know, the world has changed so much in that time. You know, I talked about communication before and the ways in which that's changed. And of course, that's been, you know, a huge part of the lockdown experiences that our family has had, is how we communicate with one another. You know, I moved back in with my folks in June of last year, and and have been renegotiating what it's like to be in a parent-child relationship as adults. I've been communicating with my family who live all over the world in new ways. Videos have become a huge part of our birthday celebrations. So we've been creating like little short films and stuff for one another to make each other laugh and to share some of the joy of being a part of this wonderful family. And yet, you know, all of that stuff, all of those kind of the seeds of to carry a sort of blunt phrase, the sort of seeds of change that you sort of see sprouting in little scions in adult life are all there as a kid, you know. So when I talked about, you know, how the West Country is kind of like a foundation or a foil to life now, I really mean that. I think there's something really quite transformative about having your identity tested in very practical terms as a Southerner in the North. You know, that's something that you and I have in common, and yet for me it feels far more complex because both my parents are Northerners, and so where do I fit in this? Because I was born in the North, and yet I spent so much of my life in the South that surely that is a part of me, and yet it's not the whole part of me. And so when I'm in a city like Liverpool and I speak the way that I do, and my frames of reference and my schooling and everything are different, even, you know, going to a secondary school, not a high school, you know, as it's called, as it will be in Liverpool, it's just ever so slightly different. So there's a real kind of complexity to, I mean, that's not extraordinary, but to me, there's a complexity to how I see my identity as being changed. I hope I can communicate some of the nuance in saying that everything and nothing changes from, you know, from point A to point B, from being a young man to being, you know, the person I am now. I don't want to be glib when I say that. It's just so difficult to kind of to articulate that experience in any sort of concise and meaningful way. But
you've spoken about the geographical changes of your identity from a Northerner to a Southerner to a Northerner again. Has the past year, both with the lockdown and with the Black Lives Matter sort of global awareness raising, has that affected your ethnic identity in any way?
It has affected the discussions around my ethnic identity a great deal. It is informed the discussions that I have had, and over the past year, a huge amount. I really can't overstate that. Like, I asked the question in our family WhatsApp group. We have this group chat of, you know, the folks of my you know, family from who are living on like just about every continent going, and I was like, and I had this desire to know what other discussions folks were having, you know, after having discussions about, you know, what the murder of George Floyd meant in terms of this ongoing onslaught against Black bodies and against identities which were seen as other, which that attack seemed to encapsulate. I had to ask the question of my family, what are the discussions about race like in your homes? And the response I got was really remarkable, because I was told, you know, because the responses were like really honest, first and foremost, which was incredible, because I'm always fearful that in being, you know, in inviting a kind of a realness or a vulnerability about something, that there will be something that is important hidden away. And yet, you know, my aunts and my uncles would, you know, told me how discussions about race were almost kind of shielded from my cousins in a way in which was impossible, or at least not our reality, for my brother and I. Now, I can't remember, Marge, if you've actually met my brother Josh.
I don't think so.
But
Not
Josh,
yet.
but not yet. But when you meet him, you'll see exactly what I mean when I say how impossible that conversation was, because as two brothers, we look incredibly different. I have this sort of, very fair-skinned complexion. Josh would be considered light-skinned, but he is ostensibly mixed, if that makes sense. You would look at, he would be profiled as being a mixed race child or a mixed race man, depending on where he is in his life. And so right from the beginning, me taking after my white father and Josh taking after our mother, whose parents are Irish and Jamaican, it was impossible not to have those discussions from an early age. So to give you an example, I would be walking around the shires in Trowbridge and the shopping mall there, and I'd bump into some friends.
The only shopping mall that's it.
It.
Shires.
Yeah, that's it. Great haunt for a young man. And oh god, I love the Ottakers there. I missed that place. That was so great, and it was so great. It was like, and we would be about them, minding our business. I'd be buying horrible history books from the Ottakers children's shelves, and we bump into friends from school who were almost always white, and they'd kind of let on and wave and whatever, and be like kind of like cheeky glances, kind of like when they'd see me with like these two other people who weren't obvious. Who are they? It was the question. And so come Monday morning after the weekend and having that discussion at school, because of, hey Joe, like, who was that woman that I saw that we saw you with? Who was that boy that we saw you with? And the discussion inevitably was, well, that's my mum and that's my brother, and then there'd be the classic kind of like drawing back, eyebrows raised, sort of. So how does that kind of polite negotiation of how do I approach this topic, because there's something that I really want to ask but I can't ask it, was always felt like the case there, and it would, and discussions would always kind of be reduced to, well, are you adopted? Like,
I knew that one was coming up.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, are they your real family? And then of course that kind of puts the idea of like, what is real family? And and that's something that I explored much later, and in different ways in my life, and yet the assumption that mixed families, maybe I'm wrong to put a judgment on it, but in my experience, mixed families were so uncommon in the West Country that they became a point of discussion and a topic of conversation.
No, I think
even with me in the room. Yeah.
No, because when my family, my parents moved to Trowbridge and Wiltshire in the late 50s. Older brother was born in 59, I was born in 60, and then another sister born in 63. And we were one of two families, black families in Wiltshire. The other one was my cousins, who came over with my father. And as you say, we were as categorized as a black family, not as a mixed family. So people say, okay, they're black, they're white, and that's it. But when you were talking about growing up in a mixed heritage family, what did that do for your identity as a young person? How did you, if you did, self-classify at all?
I had a little bit of trouble with this at first, because there was always and there still is, the question of like, well, how does one identify when you're asked to fill out a form? God, I love this topic so much, because it's just where do you begin and where do you end with it? But to try and answer the question, I was very fortunate in that there was a recognition by folks, by groups and organizations in the county, that BAME children were a significant part of the demographic, enough so that there was a space for us to meet one another. And one of my fondest memories of being in an art space as a younger man was when I must have been like 12 or 13, and my brother and I went to Salisbury Playhouse during half term for I think it was a week-long sort of half-term school for BAME children. And I loved that experience, and I love experiences like that because there were more like it in Bradford upon Avon and other centres and spaces like that where this kind of space was held for us to connect. And as a child, you don't think about it in those terms. It's just it's just nice to see folks who look like me and know what it's like. And yeah, even as kids, you don't even think about it in those terms, but upon reflection, like being able to have had those experiences where I could meet other mixed children, and we still talked about it in terms of mixed race, and I have this discussion with my mother and brother, too, about how we identify, because dual heritage was kind of the mot juste for a long time for us, and yet we kind of it's quite a fluid discussion about it as well, because I personally feel like race is something which is so stratifying and so limiting and so restrictive that for me it almost doesn't serve me to identify within the kind of the confines of race. My brother feels very differently about it, and I think that speaks to kind of the physical appearances that we both have. I will never be racialized, or I'm not immediately racialized in the world when I interact with folks, where Josh always will be. So when we were going to these these sort of half-term clubs or whatever, where we were surrounded by peers who were from all over, most of whom were like African diaspora as well. There wasn't a very large Asian community certainly not that I came across in these places. So interestingly enough, the discussions around how do you identify on a form of paper was very much, well, for me it was white and black Caribbean, and yet it was the same for Josh. And yet you look at us, you speak to us, you interact and you engage with us, and we are two completely different people, perhaps uniquely because of our circumstances. Josh eventually went to a boarding school and had a very different experience to me, whereas I always stayed in state education, and so we kind of grew separately. But in those kind of initial sort of formative years where I was asked to consider who I was, it was very instructive for me. I was sort of instructed almost by conditioning. I to go to consider the question, how do you identify, or what do you put down? And it would always be white and black Caribbean or other. And the other part was really I discovered the idea of other so much later than I needed it. And I say that because I think being able to sort of to understand and own otherness has been such a formative part of my adulthood. I would have been so curious to have had that discussion as an adolescent, because so much about that time in life is about being a misfit. You want to fit in, and yet you desperately don't want to appear as if you want to fit in.
Well, the concept of otherness is kind of central to identity, especially for people with dual heritage or multiple strands of heritage. As you say, we're racialized, and it's when we talk about racialization, we're talking about from the central norm of white European. So when you're racialized as an other, it does affect your identity and your way of being in the world. And if you're not racialized, then you have a different path to those who are, as you've just explained in your own family, as with your brother. But when we're talking, you've spoken about the global nature of your family, everybody being all over the world, and opening up these discussions about racialization, etc. Does that put you in a vulnerable position? And if so, how does that affect your mental health?
I believe that there is a necessary part of exploring these topics. I think you need to be vulnerable in order to have those discussions authentically. I don't think you can show up to those discussions and not bring a part of yourself which you usually keep covered, at least in my experience. Because I personally, I carry so much of who I am around with me in a very protected sort of way. And it's, it's what was alluded to before, the North-South thing, the white-black thing, and also in terms of queerness as well, talking about queering these false binaries, as well, in terms of how one identifies, that I am neither one nor the other, but something else. And I realized through doing talking therapy that so much of my self-identity was wrapped up in a lack of a clear narrative about who I am, and a connection to past and to present and future as well. So, almost automatically that enters into a field of health and well-being, that becomes inevitable. It becomes unavoidable that you have to examine how your daily interactions affect how you see yourself, and because of how others see you. And we talk about microaggressions in these conversations, in these dialogues that we have about race and identity, and I felt almost like an imposter, kind of feeling wounded by these, because they weren't directed at me. Obviously, I'm ostensibly white. I have all the privilege of white passing, a phrase which I'm examining very thoroughly.
That needs to be unpacked.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I'd love to unpack it with you. But I think the idea of kind of being in spaces where I would hear white folks say like the most unconscionable things because it felt safe to. And I went, no, that internally I would go, that's me. That's me and my family. That's me and my people. And yeah, I don't feel in a position to say anything. And I think that was the most disempowering thing about being in those spaces, where folks would flippantly say something that seemed to bring the whole room together around the same joke. And I felt excluded, but ostensibly was involved in that as well. And that really gets to you. That really got to me. That really affected my mental health a lot.
Well, in that kind of situation, I can see that your silence could be seen as agreement, but also for yourself, your silence is protection, because were you in the mental situations, did you have enough mental strength to deal with a whole room of people looking at you and say, what are you saying, Joe? Aren't you one of us?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, but I think you deal with things with as much information as you have at the time.
Yeah.
You can't build an atom bomb if you don't know the basics of science and physics. So you have to start. You have to start somewhere. And when we're talking about identity politics, it's really difficult. It's always going to be difficult. It's constantly changing. Our identities change every day. just like our knowledge changes every day. You spoke just now about having a kind of imposter syndrome when people are talking about things, when you felt wounded, and rightly so, as both a human being and as a person who has mixed heritage. So there's nothing wrong with you feeling wounded, but because other people were unaware why you were feeling wounded, it was difficult for you to have another conversation on top of the one that's already going on. And it's just so much. There is little wonder that it would cause anxiety and mental health concerns.
I think this is the unstated truth of the situation, is that when we are talking about mental health, we are talking about our well-being in a sense that we feel safe and protected, and at this and within the power to thrive, if that makes any sense. When I say that, I mean we're in our power. We're in our natural talent, maybe not even ability to deliver something which only we could deliver in that particular moment, place, or setting. And when you're I use the term loosely, asked to hide that part of yourself, when you're not allowed to be your true and authentic self for fear of being cast aside, ostracized, belittled. That was a big fear for me. I was in situations where I was a part of organizations or discussions where I was on the bottom rung. I was not in a position of authority, and yet was constantly looking to folks around me to be like say something, please, like come on, like I need this, and we need this too, because
do it for me.
That immediately is infantilizing. You're asking a parental authority figure to do the thing which you can't do for yourself. So in trying to be an adult, in adulting, and in trying to to grow up in the world and to be the best version of myself that I can be today, and meeting myself on those terms, a part of that conversation will always draw into question, how am I allowing myself to show up for this conversation, this issue, this problem, and how am I letting others do the same thing? And that self-awareness for me became really apparent when I considered how I had changed. When, for instance, whilst I was a part of the Young Everyman and Playhouse program, I had been a young producer for 2 years, and had very much been in a very exciting, very experimental, incredibly engaging opportunity where I was allowed to make mistakes and feel safe doing so. And then I was given a brilliant opportunity as the trainee to explore that further in a different setting, within let's say the confines of an arts and culture organization, where there are parameters to what you can do, and there are certain protocols and procedures that you have to follow, if you catch my meaning, and there's just a bit more structure to it, there's a bit more rigor. And suddenly I was having conversations with the head of HR about what would I do in a situation where I was approached by somebody who was a part of the youth theatre, who wanted to go for drinks. And I had to consider then my power had changed. I'd suddenly gone from being one of the team, one of the young bright things, making theatre, taking chances, having a great time, to then being somebody who had perceived power, at least within the sort of the the structure of the organization. You know, as the trainee, I was given a degree of responsibility, and with that came power, as Uncle Ben would say. And I think that was a real game changer. I suddenly had to consider my relationship to folks that I was interacting with in a whole new way. I had a very small amount of power, and yet that was stacked on top of having almost no power in these discussions. That, you know, that when it came to, you know, making important decisions and like, I just wasn't really, I wasn't really prepared for that. And through nobody's fault, I don't think we really have these conversations. We don't really coach one another to prepare each other to take on responsibility and to adjust to that shift in power, and to be aware of what that feels like, what that means for you and the other person, the other people, and where you find yourself in these situations, because it's such a dramatic change for one to go through, that now it would be, I think, you know, a sort of a lack of duty of care to not consider those things. And so I'm very alive to that in the work that I do as a community organizer. You know, when I'm working with younger people, I really think it's something I'm very, very switched on to, sort of in the classic sort of sense of like, of not wanting to repeat the mistakes that you know, with that kind of sort of Philip Larkin way, you know, when your parents mess you up and they don't mean to, sort of thing. You know, you don't want to, you kind of swing the other way. Of course, it leaves blind spots in other areas, but I really hope that in having these conversations about what our experiences are, we can show up and be authentic. And I do believe that requires a degree of vulnerability, and it has to, because we can't show up and be our full selves and not bring a part of that privacy or that private aspect of us to it, if we're gonna ask others to engage in a meaningful way. Sure, we can have, you know, public discussions, and, you know, we can meet in the public realm, and we can grandstand and showboat and do all and say all the right things, make all the right noises, but where has that ever gotten us? Where has that ever changed? You know, and you know, this is, you know, so I really welcome the kind of the opportunity to have this kind of discussion.
So, well, the environment that you were in at the Everyman Fairs on the Young Producers Programme, they gave you permission to fail in a safe space.
Very much, yeah.
And they sort of nurtured you in the shift of power between, from like when we were talking before, you mentioning about almost like a parent-child power imbalance. So they sort of helped you to step up, if you like.
Yeah.
So now that you've learned that, it also sounds like you've got the baton and you're passing it on in the community to make a positive change. How does that feel to you now?
God, this is an unexamined question for me. And strangely enough, I was actually speaking to the CEO of the Cumbre Amani, Michelle Charters, the other day about this exact thing. And she would love the use of your phrase, passing the baton. This is something which she really advocates for in the work that we do. And I asked her the same question, really, in different terms. I asked her what it meant to pass the baton and the like, and listened very intently to her answer, because I was always sort of searching for the answer
for yourself.
you know.
And that's how we learn, though.
It is, and she could, and you know, she could only proffer her own take on it, her own intentions for the project which we run at the Cumbre. And yeah, when you ask me to consider it myself, my brain scrambles, because I first of all, I so desperately want to get it right. You don't want to mess anyone up. You don't want to make that mistake. And yet I know that in taking that step towards whatever it is I think I'm trying to do, whatever it is that the intention is, there will always be something unconsidered, chaos, chance, randomness. It's in there. And I think with wanting to pass the baton, myself, gosh, I I think it's about wanting to provide the same opportunities that I was given to others. Because I've been incredibly privileged, Marge. Like I've had so many opportunities handed to me, so many experiences available to me because others have had that same thought themselves, that it's important to make this available to others too. And it's really not that grandiose. I think that's what I'm just realizing, is that actually it feels it feels incredibly significant, and perhaps rightly so, because it is. But at the same time, it's the really small things that we do in that really inform that.
It's simple and effective, because what you're saying is that you've worked in a model that gives you space and permission to fail, but also builds you up, and that's what you're passing on. And this, although it sounds like, okay, that's really simplistic, but because it's so effective, why not pass it on? And take the joy in that as being part of the climate of change, really positive change.
Definitely, the climate of change is a really interesting phrase for it, because that is almost just like a permanent state, is it not? You know, we're always in a state of some flux, I think. And what's important, I think, is just to kind of to hold those moments of ebb and flow where they are, you know, kind of, you know, in my very loose layman's understanding of sort of a Taoist philosophy, you know, that kind of movement with the forces of nature, you know, whether it's being blown with the breeze or being moved by the current of the stream or the ocean. You go with the flow, and when you're being moved along with change, it can be really exciting and really empowering, because it's almost kind of like something is sort of, it can feel like something is moving through you, and yet really you're just kind of being moved along, right? You know, like, you know, if you think about it in
well, you're saying
terms.
You're being moved along, aren't you part of the moving?
Well, exactly, yeah. Where does the change begin and ends, internally and externally, right? You know, I think change that happens outside naturally manifests itself internally, but I think it works both ways, and maybe isn't even limited to just a binary one in, one out, you know. If I'm open to receiving new information, and, you know, in a phrase we like to use around the office, not, you know, don't hold too tightly to my assumptions, I can receive new information, you know. I can grow in a way in which perhaps feels not only, well, maybe not only feels, but actually is more sustainable. And I think that's kind of one of the things that, you know, through the work that we do at LA to Better Place, with wanting to build a community which is a place where folks can work and live and thrive. You want that to be something that's lasting. And I think it's been very curious for me, having conversations with men recently about legacy. I'm very used to kind of discussions about artists and, you know, penmanship being, you know, surrogates for, you know, for sort of patriarchal sort of, you know, dissemination and the like, and it's all very and yet I I found it really interesting speaking to men who are looking at that in a different sort of way, and who are, you know, looking at not, who are perhaps using the vocabulary of legacy and actually grasping for something else, because it exists outside of our normalized vocabulary about it, you know. You know, forgive me for sort of talking in, you know, in jargon, but the kind of like the sort of cis heteronormative way of looking at the world, as you said before, you know, the kind of the norm, as it were, is not the honest truth for all of us. And so I think one of the things which is so nourishing about these discussions that I've had has been that we're looking at building something which outlasts us. And just this morning, I was having coffee with a friend of mine, whose name is James, and who is a theatre maker and a clown and a circus performer, and who is also an educator too. We were discussing, learning more about ourselves by examining sort of the microscopic and how that enlightens the kind of the macroscopic. And I think there's something really, really fascinating about the fact that what I had grown up thinking was legacy, children, the future, let their laughter remind us how we used to be, is actually just only one way of looking at it. But it taps into the essence of what it is we want to build, which is a better space. And we talked about this kind of, the sort of the Hebrew sort of promised land and getting to the top of the mountain in order to see that. And actually you're kind of moving yourself and the tribe towards that, the sort of the we of the community towards that, but you may never actually get there yourself. And I think that is a much truer and, dare I say, sort of more comfortable view of that than I've perhaps been used to. And what I think is significant about us men having that conversation is that it's not so much about us, projecting ourselves onto the world. It's about us investing and a part of ourselves into the world.
How do you think it's different for men and women talking about legacy? Have you sort of eavesdropped on women's conversations about legacy, or have you been aware of online discussions? And how is there a striking difference between those conversations and the ones you're having with men nowadays?
It's a very good question. And it's made me aware of the fact that I perhaps am having these discussions in slightly different ways with women. The sort of the influential women in my life are almost all of them mothers, and have a very different set of, I wanted to say priorities, and yet that's not really it. And I think this speaks to kind of like my lack of understanding of the differences. I can only speak my own experience, and I feel that the discussions that will be had about legacy amongst women, although I'm not privy to them in those terms just yet, I'll be very curious to pay attention to those when they come up, because maybe there will be some difference, and maybe there won't be. But I suspect that we'll be talking around the same things, just from a slightly different perspective. Like the blind men and the elephant. You're all feeling different parts of the same creature, and yet it's the same thing.
Interestingly, though, we've spoken about two genders and their perspectives, but there is, like you say, there is so many other ways of seeing and being in this world.
This is very true.
That's quite limiting. And likewise, when we talk about legacy, we can talk about where we are now, Liverpool. The local and national majority would be mainly white people. But if we talk globally, the global majority is Black people. What the legacy will be, the perception of legacy will be different from those different perspectives.
True.
So I like the phrase that you said earlier, because we're in the climate of change, but don't hold too tightly to my assumptions, because when we're looking with one set of glasses at a fact, a situation, we will obviously come up with one set of conclusions. But if we open it up, then how do we open it up to, how do we cross these boundaries? It reminds me, I'll just, the reason why I asked that is porous borders. When I know that you're into James Baldwin now, because when I did some James Baldwin work some time ago, I wrote, my dissertation was on porous borders, and how things changed so easily. It's not not like concrete borders. Everything's just insidious in a positive and a negative way.
Mm.
How do we get to that state where we exist with porous borders between each other?
Isn't that the question?
Vale.
I'm really glad. I'm really glad that you mentioned the kind of the kind of the fact that whilst we're having this discussion about men and women, we're actually eliding the point that we're a part of a discussion that is about more than two genders. That we're a part of a discussion that is about acknowledging and honoring the experiences of each individual. And in borrowing Baldwin's phrase about porous borders, I think about how my education, in informal as it is, in queer theory has come to kind of to supplement some of that, my understanding of that. Now, you know yourself, I came to the writings of Jane Baldwin quite late, but
you're there though. You've arrived.
But I'm exactly, yeah, and I know from what you've told me about the writings that you did on him and Nina Simone, that there is something about the need to extend your hand towards others in order to feel that clasping back and feel that connection. So I think it's a really beautiful invitation to consider that. I will say straight off the bat, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I know immediately that that's fine. And I think that we come from a long tradition of thinkers who in acknowledging the limits of their knowledge finds a deeper well of wisdom in that too. And I think I don't mean to sound pompous when I say that. I just think there's something worth honoring the fact that we don't know. Like, there is such a fluid conversation, or fluent conversation, if you like, between polarities, that when it comes to examining myself, I can't help but see my embodiment of polarities. We talk about political whiteness and political blackness. What does it mean? We talk about the North and the South. Where is that line drawn? It's like, really, it's kind of liminal. It's kind of, but it's an in-between space. It's like, so we can, in the sort of Churchillian way, draw lines on a map and go, well, this is such a place, and this is there, and yet in kind of like the sort of topography of life, you can't really do that, or at least I don't find it useful to. I think in wanting to examine and then disrupt the false binaries that exist in our lives, I'm finding a truer sense of connection to myself. And that connection to myself allows me to communicate with others my authentic truth and my authentic self, which requires that vulnerability we talked about. And then with that invitation, I think like that Marianne Williamson poem, it's like, your light automatically liberates others. You say to another person, sort of unconsciously, this is who I am, and that invites the other person to gift you who they are, and then you can start to see not just the difference in your experiences and perspective, but the similarities. And it's, I think, by acknowledging the sort of the polarity of those two things, that we start to build a sense of community and sense of the we. And I was talking before with my friend about the spirit of Ubuntu, which, in very loose and reductive terms, is I am because we are.
Exactly.
And yet this phrase kind of encapsulates this sense of looking at the microscopic and looking at the macroscopic too, that there are things about us that are universal. And we had this great discussion about ginger roots and rhizomes and queer theory, and how everything is fluid and interconnected. And yeah, we can talk about our fathers and our mothers, but we also have to talk about our brothers and sisters who aren't going to feel their most authentic self in identifying as being a man or a woman in the way in which I was certainly raised to think was the correct way to think about stuff. And and of course this starts inviting all sorts of conversations about language and vocabulary. But at the end of the day, we're figuring this out as we go.
Well, exactly.
And we've got to retain compassion about that too. And I think in extending that kindness towards others, that invitation to be curious and inquiring about one another, I hope that kind of in itself becomes the practice of extending ourselves towards that aforementioned sort of promised land. We may not get there ourselves, but you kind of hope that
we're
the tribe
on the route.
Yeah.
And we're making this path smoother for those coming behind, which is important. Going back to one of the things that you said as well, you said about sometimes you have to say, I don't know. And I think it's important to see that not as a failure or a lacking of any kind, but as wisdom. Because when you're wise enough to say, I don't know, then you are leaving room for growth. And hence, when you're looking at the similarities of people, you say, well, okay, we've got these things. It's part of the openness for, instead of, as you say, going for polarities of, you're either one, like binary.
Yeah.
Because in computing, it was always 1 or 0. But there's more to it. There's more to each of us. And so one of the questions I'd like to ask you is, what next? What do you see for the future for yourself and for your community?
Gosh, it's such a gorgeous question, because because literally in this moment, thinking about it, almost anything is possible, and it's a case of when, maybe. I'll slightly preamble, as I want to do, and just sort of look at the sort of incremental change that I think we've grown tired of, and I think has kind of become a case of personally making peace with that fact. And I say this in the context of, Tracy Chapman, if not now, then when, Sam Cooke, a change is going to come. It's been a lot, just like all of this kind of.
Got the list of the tunes coming out there.
It is, like, and that when I think about my time in Wiltshire, in the kitchen, that was the stuff that was playing. So that very much so. Where I'm going is informed by where I've been, and I think it's important to kind of it's just, as I said before, have an understanding, like have a connection to the past and where I've been, and also a sort of an openness to the future. I guess it's kind of about having like clasping hands, like a root, but a sort of or not too firm a handle on the past that I can't move into the future, and yet a sort of an open enough sort of hand to kind of pull my. It's kind of a linear kind of way of looking at it, but I guess that's just how I experience time. But kind of like being present is a really important process for me at the moment, reminding myself that there is more than just this moment, but there is always this moment too, which is this whole kind
which is important,
which is important too. And in the discussion that we've had earlier this year about mental health awareness in the context of what has felt like Groundhog Day for many of us, in terms of stuff feeling stagnant and not feeling like it's moving, recognizing that internal change, recognizing that there is always a climate of change, there is always a movement of some sort, even when it doesn't feel like it, and that there isn't ever really a start and an end to this stuff. This is where the rhizome theory came into discussion before. You cut open a ginger root and it's just, and there's no beginning or end. It's ever connected to its other parts.
Otherwise it would be limiting, wouldn't it, if you had a beginning and end?
And I think there's philosophers have had ways of talking about this in different ways for years. I first came across like Nietzsche talking about time as a flat circle when I was about 18 at some philosophy lunch club that I had at school, and became fascinated by this idea that like, history repeats itself, but it feels kind of like it's moving, in a linear sort of left to right sort of fashion if you're, Western reading like I am. And I think the notion of like what comes next is so gorgeous, because the scene is set, to talk in theatrical terms, lights up on Toxteth LA, and we have so much going on here. There is such a rich, the assets that we have in this community are so plentiful, from the people, the kindness of folks here, the willingness to extend generosity and hospitality to visitors and to one another, to act neighborly towards one another, to be neighborly towards one another, most importantly, is often seen as being, I think, the kind of the crux of this community. And yet when we look at like, the sort of the physical edifices around, as we look at the buildings and the architecture and the parks, let's just honor the beautiful parks we have in LA too.
Gorgeous.
Just gorgeous places to kind of to paint scenes and to allow ourselves a place to thrive, whether that be in, quiet meditation and prayer, or in whatever setting you choose, or in the hustle and bustle of life on Granby Market, when looking forward when that comes back, and or Lodge Lane, that's endlessly kind of moving and turbulent, and yet there's a kind of there's a fluency there that I think suggests something intangible, like something that you can't quite put your finger on, and that frisson I think is really exciting. So anything could come next, and yet the things that will come are probably kind of already set in motion. And yet
that's beautiful.
And yet, when it comes to that those small moments of rare chance or luck, or stumbling into a career that, like for me, that I didn't see for myself, or encountering a person who you didn't quite know where you knew them from, but you eventually figured out why you knew each other, and why you were, dare I say, meant to know one another. I think there's something really encouraging about that. It's all going to be fine. That's I think something that I would like to take forward from this, is that throughout all this rumination and discussion about where things have been and will be and how they are, it will pass. It will always do that. It will always change. We live in a climate of change. That is one fundamental truth. Taxes, death, change. It's not, it's always going to be a state of movement in one direction or another. I can't say where it's going. I can't say when it's going to get there, but it's going to keep moving, and you better just like buckle in and just have a good time with it wherever you can.
That's I like your.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
No, it's been great. Where do I sign up?
Oh dear.
But you said also, where you're going is informed by where you've been. What about if you had to sort of finish off your TED Talk in any way, and suggest to people who don't know their past, what kind of direction could you give them to help them to know their past before they can, like you say, live in the present and look forward to the future?
Gosh, that is a question for my younger self.
Interestingly, I did have that for your 18-year-old self and yourself now.
Yeah, I think that is okay, so I'm going to imagine like sitting down with 18-year-old Joe, and it does fall on some of the platitudes that we're common to, it like that it does get better. It really does. And I think amongst that is acknowledging that it's not a sort of well, let me borrow Dr. King's analogy, like the sort of like the universe bends towards light, it's like that's kind of the way in which the world works. But it's not a kind of, it's not necessarily about always going upwards and ascending towards anything in particular. But maybe it's nice to think about it that way, maybe it's nice to kind of think that.
Just think about movement, not necessarily direction.
Exactly. I've been sober for just over a year now, and been looking at the road to recovery in terms of of not being a straight line, but about kind of like a kind of very sort of concentric, sort of roundy, sort of back in on itself, messy, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly thing that isn't necessarily experienced from point A to point B in any ordinary and straightforward way, but is nonetheless a form of direction-full movement. That younger self would need to hear that, and I think anyone who needs to hear that ought to know that it's okay not to know. I didn't know until very recently that just where my folks were from. We had suspicions that my grandmother was Irish, because that's what we'd been told. She'd been dead such a long time, we weren't able to archive those stories. And yet my mum did one of those DNA tests, and it was like, the classic Scouser. It was like, a third West African, like a third County Cork, Ireland, and wonderfully a third Scandinavian, like from Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and one part Ashkenazi Jew as well. Interestingly enough, just throwing just to season the top of that, and yet not knowing that changes nothing, and it changes everything. It's like, it's one of those things that you kind of have to hold both things in mind at once, and that's the hardest thing about being in a place where you feel stuck. If you ever feel like you're in a rut, and if, like me, you find yourself in a depressed state more often than you'd like to, you'll become used to this negative self-talk that there is no point, and that there is no reason to this. And maybe it's just about letting go of that idea of there being a point and there being reason. Like, that's only one way of looking at stuff. Like, not everything works towards a point. Let's take Nietzsche's flat circle again. It's like it goes round and of itself, even if we can't see it. And the point from A to B.
It's also the idea of people looking for perfection, an ideal family, an ideal life, an ideal car, whatever. When our label, if you like, is human beings, we are more about doing than being. If we spent more time being, then we wouldn't be chasing these elusive dreams, which don't really add to our being at all.
Yeah,
they just tire us out.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. We need to allow ourselves to be sad every once in a while. Be confused, be angry if you need to be. If that's where the feeling is, if that's the feeling that's arising, honor that and meet that where you need to. And that is on those terms. Whatever you are feeling, it is a message from your body that something is crying out to be acknowledged. Talk about the parent-child thing again. We communicate in terms in which we don't necessarily always understand, but I think it's about listening. I think listening to those thoughts in your most lucid and sort of metacognizant moments, just like return to that feeling that it will be fine, and you are definitely worthy enough. You are definitely strong enough. You absolutely have this. And
I feel a church response coming on, like, amen, brother.
Yes, absolutely. It's do you know what? I love that you mentioned congregation, because I think that to me is a really lovely way of tying that idea off. If you're a part of a church, you're not a part of a building, you're a part of a group of people who are calling and responding to one another, in that sort of ancient ritualized way. You are sharing a truth together that is offered and received. And I think if you're ever inclined to reach out to somebody, for the sake of all things good and everything else, do it.
Yeah.
you're, to be very real for a moment, you're reaching out to me a few weeks ago just to check in and just to make a connection after such a long time of not having a connection with one another for such a long time meant so much, because we were able to sort of hold a time together that isn't possible without that ability to give and take. And I think it was really just I think that moment in and of itself was a lesson to me about the importance of reaching out. Do it whenever you do it. Just do it. Like it's a
Nike thing.
It is a Nike thing. But they've got it right in this case. Like, I want to make it clear that it's not about it's not imperative that you do it, but I think it's a really fortifying, to borrow Rio's phrase, there's a really fortifying thing to do is to share yourself with someone else. When I messaged her the other week and thanked her for her honesty in sharing herself, and in a very public way, some time ago, I was really touched by her response, where she used the phrase fortifying. She said it was really fortifying to hear that it had resonated with me, and it really had. And so that could be it. That could be the kind of the note that we build our church upon, Marge, our church of fortifying moments.
And I think of which Rio is the high priestess or priest, whichever nomenclature she wants to use.
Whichever she wants. I'm honored to be part of the congregation, and I'm delighted to have been inducted into this very sacred covenant with you both. All hail.
Well, Joe, this afternoon has been delightful, and I would just like to thank you for holding this space, that we could have together and to commune, because I think we've got deep, we've been real, we've been vulnerable, sharing things about ourselves, and I hope that other people will gain some benefit from listening to this or watching this whenever they do. So,
well, I hope so too, and thank you so much, Marge. I was not expecting to have a discussion quite like this, and I love that we have. It's been a real joy and a pleasure. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the suggestion, and thank you for just being you. I think it's worth saying you are such a magnificent human being.
Thank you.
You be very well. You don't just do well, you be well. You're a real light, and I just want to thank you for that. You've done more for me than I will articulate with words, but I hope you know just how important you are to me and to others as well. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
I have no more words. So this is Marjorie H. Morgan with We Talk, and I've been here with Joe Ramsden.
Thank you very much.